Hi, welcome to musicmoose.org. This is DJ James, continuing our lesson on modal harmony, and today the topic I want to sort of work with is guide tones. Now, if you haven't heard of guide tones before, they are the key and the absolute most important thing for any jazz guitarist, for any guitarist who's interested in playing over the changes, in furthering their playing, in basically taking theory to the next level in a lot of the stuff that they're doing. The basic theory behind the guide tone is that within every chord, well, especially within jazz, the chords that we're playing are generally based off the triad, our first, third, fifth, then our seventh. And sometimes the upper structure, which I'm sure some other lessons on Music Moose and some that I'll do in the future will deal with upper structure in the chords, including the 9, the 11, and the 13, which are the most important parts of the upper structure. Either way, when we're dealing with our basic chords, we're generally dealing with 4-note chords, our triad, root, third, fifth, and then the seventh. So in the last lesson, we dealt with the 2-5-1 progression, the standard 2-5-1 progression in C major. We're going to stick with that, but today, talk about guide tones. So here's our 2-5-1 progression. Our 3 chords there, D minor 7, G7, C major 7. Now the guide tones for every chord, any chord imaginable, unless we're talking about complete modal chords where we're dealing with fourths, but any chord where we're dealing with thirds, your guide tones are the 3rd and the 7th of the chord. They're called the guide tones because they're the 2 most important notes of the chord. So long as you have those 2 notes in there, you have the quality of the chord. So for instance, let's listen to our D minor 7 again. Our 4 notes in the chord are D, F, A, and C. Now the D and the A, in a lot of ways, are expendable, especially as a guitarist. As a guitarist, there's the old saying in jazz, never worry about the root because the bassist has it. So you just play the parts of the chord that you want, and the bassist will get the D. And the 5th is always the most expendable part of the chord, unless we're playing something where the 5th is altered. So, for instance, if we're playing a 2-5-1 progression in minor, well, then we have an altered 5th on that first chord on the 2, which is generally a minor 7 flat 5. So this would be a D minor 7 flat 5. Then that 5 becomes really important. But anytime we're playing in major, that 5 really isn't important. In fact, when we're soloing, we flat that 5 all the time as a blue note. So, as someone who's comping, or even as someone who's soloing, don't worry about the 5th. Your most important notes are always your 3rd and your 7th. So let's start out with the D minor 7. What are our guide tones for that? Well, if we take a look, D, F, A, and C, the 3rd and the 7th are the F and the C. However, when we're playing this voicing, they're up here. Okay. So those are our guide tones. Now when we move to the G7, G, B, D, F, our guide tones are the 3rd and the 7th again, the B and the F. Okay. And then once we move to the C major 7, we've got C, E, G, B. And our guide tones, the 3rd and the 7th there, are the B and the E. Okay. And in the last lesson, I did sort of a one-string progression for you, showing the inner motion of the voices, where I went from the F to the E. Now, if we listen to the motion of the guide tones, this is pretty much what guides any progression. In jazz, in so many tonal music and so many Western musics, the guide tones are what guides our progression, guides our ears. This is how we hear motion in music. This is how we hear, it's why we call it a chord progression, how we hear things progress. So if we start out with the guide tones here, we have our C and our F, 2, our B and F, B and E. And whenever we think of 5 of 5s, moving by the circle of fifths, it's always motion within those guide tones. And we could keep descending. And that implies so much more than just 2 notes at a time. You start to hear full progressions out of this, and this is really the basis of jazz and basis of a lot of Western tonal music. Now, the importance of the guide tones, we're going to start with guide tones being important for comping, for accompanying. If anyone has listened to the best place to hear guide tone comping, this type of comping, is old Count Basie records. Freddie Green, the guitarist for Count Basie, used to do this all the time. And his method for playing guide tone comping, which has been adopted by every big band guitarist since, has been based on the guide tones. Okay? If you listen to big band comping, it's always 2 or 3 note voicings in the guitar, never ever playing the root, and rarely playing the fifth. So a Freddie Green type comp would be, and we hear that sort of 4 on the floor, that chunk sound that, even though Freddie Green is the person who really sort of made it famous, it comes along earlier when we get our first jazz guitarist, Django Reinhardt, that type of sound. And those 2-note voicings, they work really well in the middle of a jazz ensemble, and they do because they're light, but they give us a very good idea of where the sound is headed. So what I always tell students, what I always tell any guitarist who ask questions about how to really play jazz, how to get into understanding progressions, the first thing you should do for any song that you have, any chart, is to take a look at the chart, and with every chord, write down your guide tones. Create a guide tone line so that you know exactly where the 3rd and the 7th are at every chord at every moment. If you know that, you can negotiate just about any tune. In the next lesson, I'm going to talk about how we can use our guide tones to begin to solo, to really refine the idea of the scale of the moment, which I talked about in the second lesson on modal harmony and on soloing. So, from musicmoose.org, this is DJ James, and catch you on the next lesson.